stage joining Prof. Tommy Koh and Mr. Jamshed Godrej, Ambassador Hardeep Singh Puri, former diplomat and permanent representative of India to UN in New York and Geneva, and Professor Vishal Mahbubani, Dean and Professor in the Practice of Public Policy, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. And now to speak on the topic of foreign and security policy, I would like to please invite Ambassador Puri.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, I was a little apprehensive when you said that the next session is going to be, I don't know what term you used, but I think you were looking for entertainment. And I have every intention to respond to your instructions, but without entering into the realm of entertainment. So, given the 15 minutes that are provided, I have to make a choice. I have to choose, and quickly. Do I catalogue what has been done by the new government in the last 80 years and 80 days and what is in the pipeline? Or do I take the liberty of giving you a sense of what I think the new government's foreign and security policy will be? And with your permission, sir, I will opt for the latter. If this debate were to be taking place in a less civilized environment, I would be criticized, because that is the nature of the political discourse in India, by saying that the government has no strategy, you're taking a lot of ad hoc decisions, what is so new, this is continuity, there is no change, and so on. Let me therefore try and focus on what I think is new and what could be new in the foreign and security policy of the Modi government. Let me start, sir, with the mandate. For the first time in many decades, we have a newly elected government which has the mandate to rework and reboot foreign and security policy. Let me start with the BJP's manifesto. And this manifesto was drafted well before anyone anticipated that the massive mandate would be forthcoming. And I read from the manifesto, it says, the vision is to fundamentally reboot and reorient foreign policy goals, content and process in a manner that locates India's global strategic engagement in a new paradigm and on a wider canvas. That is not just limited to political diplomacy, but also includes our economic, scientific, cultural, political and security interests, both regional and global, on the principles of equality and mutuality, so that it leads to an economically stronger India and its voice is heard in the international fora. And then I will just give you one more short quote from the manifesto. It says, we will build a strong, self-reliant and self-confident India, regaining its rightful place in the comity of nations. In this, we will be guided by our centuries-old tradition. Our foreign policy will be based on best national interest. We will create a web of allies to mutually further our interests, and so on. Now, how is this different from the position as reflected in the manifestos of earlier governments prior to the election? First and foremost, there is no country-specific reference in the manifesto, and that was deliberately so decided. Because after coming back to power after 10 years, I think the intention was to re-evaluate all our relationships and work them in such a way as to rebuild the domestic economy And in that process, there were some emphases which became clear within days of the election results coming. One is the newly elected Prime Minister's firm belief that rebuilding the economy, reviving the momentum for economic growth, and all other priorities are unlikely to be facilitated unless we have peace in our immediate neighborhood. The invitation to the heads of state and government from the SAARC countries at the inauguration of the new government was, to that extent, a carefully considered and well thought through initiative. The signal that was intended, and I think that signal succeeded, was to convey to them that their economic well-being, that their security are issues which are intimately linked with India's own security and well-being. There was an apprehension prior to that event that at least two of those heads of state and government who might be invited could face some embarrassment. In one case from a state government, which was trying to conduct foreign policy on its own terms. And in another case that, there are problems outstanding, was it such a good idea to invite? And I think the decision to go ahead and invite the heads of state and government from the SAARC countries was very well considered and I think well thought through. What else is new? I think it is clear that there is a more pronounced focus on hard economic content in foreign policy. It is also clear that this is a government whose policies are more firmly anchored in national security. It is also clear that the government is currently engaged on an evaluation of the precise state of play in the more important and critical bilateral relationships, and I mean the ones apart from those in the neighborhood, with countries like the United States, China, etc. I mentioned earlier that there were no country-specific references in the party manifesto or subsequently. The President's address was criticized by many, some for good reason, that references to certain regions in the world were missing. I tried to point out, to the extent that I was heard, that it is not necessary to list the new government's foreign policy priorities in a document right at the beginning of one's term. 80 days is work in progress, and I think a strategic doctrine or an overview will emerge after this process is over and after the first round of contacts have taken place. Clearly, the Look East policy, which is institutionally bipartisan and on which there has been never any disagreement, will, I think, be reinforced and elevated, and signs to that effect are already in play. The Prime Minister's forthcoming engagements point in that direction, and it is also very clear that the interaction which will take place with China, the interactions which will take place with Japan, and the interactions which will take place as a result of the bilateral in and out visits, all point in that direction. As a student of foreign and security policy, someone who has worked in government for the last 40 years, I also detect one or two new elements. Without exception, I believe, and I say this with all humility, I have many senior colleagues in the profession sitting here and some younger ones, I have always marveled at the very high reluctance of the Indian political class to factor in national concerns and demands during interaction at the summit level and at the ministerial level. Many of our foreign ministers and heads of state and government in the past have shied away from raising projects and economic interests in the interaction at their level, because they have either regarded these to be mercantilist preoccupations, but I think it also stemmed from a certain disconnect between foreign policy and domestic policy. Foreign policy was regarded as something esoteric to be conducted in terms of a country's image, and that predates the present era where our exports account for 24% of our GDP, and I'm the one who used the figure of 43%. I'm often challenged, but if you look at exports accounting for 24% of GDP, and you look at our import bill and remittances, the figure is actually that high, if not higher. The Modi government to that extent is very different. Even some of the heads of state and government who came to the celebration of democracy, the inauguration of the newly elected Prime Minister, were somewhat taken aback when, during the course of what they thought would be a courtesy call kind of first interaction, he wanted to know from them as to what, for instance, was his counterpart's thinking on some issue which had a bearing on our security, or for that matter, how his counterparts plan to deal with certain issues. So we have a hands-on Prime Minister, somebody who is unlikely to be weighed down or be unduly influenced by policy positions of the past. Changes will come, but they will, I believe, be in the nature of what a professional colleague of mine the other day called prudent gradualism. There was a school of thought that the Modi victory will mean a more robust Charles Atlas kind of posturing vis-a-vis some neighbors. I always knew that was not going to be the case. I think he will give diplomacy a full play. He is unlikely to react with the same degree of restraint that some of his predecessors in office have displayed when threats to our national security were there. But then I draw comfort from his own assertions that if we get our act together within the country, those who have views on interaction with us, which we may regard as inimical, will also give it a second thought. And I believe that is the nature of that is the state of play as I read it. Secondly, I believe that he is unlikely to be constrained in terms of traditional positions. If, for instance, our relations with our Western neighbor do not show the kind of forward movement that is expected or that we expect, he is unlikely to hold back. I think things will move very quickly with the other countries in the SAARC grouping. And I think signs to that effect are already there. I heard a bell ring, and therefore let me turn to one part to take care of, to take advantage of Kishore's presence with us today. He is my, in some respects, my guru when it comes to reform of the Security Council and expansion. And I always draw inspiration from him because I find that the risk-averse nature of my own colleagues, both in the government and those who served in the government, is such that they've failed to see what I think is an inevitability. That is one, that the current structure of the United Nations Security Council, devised as it was in the immediate post-Second World War era, is no longer tenable. That structure is not in a position to respond to threats to global peace and security, which it was designed to. And that unless that structure is reformed, and includes countries which are now in a position to shoulder responsibility and make a contribution to addressing threats to global peace and security. The structure of the Security Council itself is likely to become a bigger question mark than it already is. I'm not going to misuse or take advantage of your hospitality to make out a case for India's permanent membership. I think that will require a separate occasion. But I do hope that Singapore, with the intellectual leadership it provides, as evident in settings like this, and with its leadership of the Forum of Small States, which are over 100 in number, will continue to press for reform in order to ensure and enhance the vitality of the multilateral institutions, which are so very important to countries which are not permanent players. With those limited words, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Puri. I would like to invite Prabha Mani to give his answer.
Thank you very much. I think someone left a cell phone here. First of all, let me begin by congratulating Jamshed and Tommy. I've attended several India-Singapore strategic dialogues. This is the 7th one, and this is by far the largest and most successful dialogue. And I'm really impressed, Jamshed, at the strength and caliber of the team that came from India. And yesterday, when we were having our closed-door session, it was the largest ever table that we ever had for the India-Singapore strategic dialogue. And I think it's a sign of things to come in the years to come. So, as Tommy said, I've learned from him that I can only make 3 points. I'm going to make 3 points. One, it's about India's geopolitical sweet spot. And it's a remarkable sweet spot that India is entering. 2, as Ambassador Hardeep Singh Puri alluded to, I'll speak a few words about Security Council reform, which is way overdue. And you don't have to make a case for India, it's obvious. And 3, about India-ASEAN relations. And I'll do that in 10 minutes. First, about the geopolitical sweet spot. I mean, we always say that we live in interesting times. But the times have never been as interesting as they are today. Because we're going through a remarkable turning point in history. And how would I describe this remarkable turning point in history? It is that sometime, maybe this year, maybe next year, maybe maximum 2 years from now, for the first time in 200 years, a non-Western power will emerge as the #1 economic power in the world. This changes everything. You know, in 1980, in PPP terms, China's share of the global GNP was only 2.2%, while the United States was 25%. Sometime around now, United States share is going to slide to 17.6%, and China's will reach about 18%. And this is a remarkable moment in human history, which is going to change everything. And I can tell you that everybody is trying to adjust to this new world order. Even the West is trying to find ways and means of dealing with a much more powerful and stronger China. And when the West looks around and wants to buy an insurance policy against a rising China, they look around the world and they see that the only other big country that has the potential someday to match China is India. So India's geopolitical importance, which has always been very high, is going to climb higher and higher in the years to come. I don't keep data, but I suspect the Indian chief of protocol kept data on the number of heads of government or heads of state who want to pay visits to India. I'm sure it's going up like this, and it will continue to rise like this. So the big question, therefore, that the world is asking is, can or will India take advantage of this geopolitical opportunity? And I'm actually very optimistic that Prime Minister Modi will be able to do so. You know, I've only met him once. I only spent 2 hours with him, and I called on him in my capacity as chairman of the Lee Kuan Yew World City Nominating Prize Committee. And I was truly impressed by the 2 hours I spent with him. As everybody has said, as Gautam Thapar said also earlier today, he's a can-do man, a hands-on man who gets things done. And he has a very open attitude to the world. And at a time when the West shunned him, he went to China 3 or 4 times. He understands China's economic performance. And despite the fact he didn't get visas from UK and USA, he's put that aside and he's going to go to the United States. So if he remains open and accessible to all the great powers, I'm confident that he can take advantage of this remarkable geopolitical opportunity that is naturally coming India's way. And India, in that sense, is fortunate that it has the right Prime Minister at the right point of history to take advantage of this geopolitical opportunity that is coming its way. So all this also leads to my second point about Security Council reform. And this is a subject, like Tomiko, like my colleagues, I spent many years studying it, and it's pretty obvious that this UN Security Council has a very powerful dilemma to resolve. It's got to choose between its composition and its credibility. It can keep its present composition, 5 permanent members, USA, China, Russia, UK, France, and they have veto powers and they can block any reform. But if they don't change their composition, they will lose their credibility and people will ignore the UN Security Council. So actually, we've reached a stage where it is now in the interests of the UN Security Council to integrate the new powers from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Because if you don't do that, the credibility will not be there. And frankly, of all the countries in the world that actually deserve clearly a seat in the UN Security Council, it's so obviously India. And you know, earlier on, in the fascinating debate between Gautam Thapar and Barry Desker, India was sometimes being criticized for being too strong in blocking things and so on and so forth. But ironically, when it comes to Security Council reform, I am struck by how weak India is in pushing for UN Security Council reform. Relatively speaking, given your case, you should be pushing even harder. And this is why in my book, Hardeep, I suggested that we can come up with a new 777 formula for Security Council reform, where you have 7 permanent members, 7 semi-permanent members, and 7 elected members. And I believe that that's the formula that can get India a place in the UN Security Council. It can be done, and at some point in time, UK and France will wake up and realize that they have gone by their sell-by date already, They represent yesterday's powers, and it's time for them to make their way for tomorrow's great powers. You can quote me to the British and French. I put that in print already. Finally, before the second bell rings, a quick word about India and ASEAN. And I can tell you that of all the sessions we had yesterday, we had an incredibly lively discussion on India and ASEAN and the closed-door dialogue. And here too, it's very clear, just stating the obvious, ASEAN too is affected by rising China. If you just open the headlines, you can see ASEAN too, quite naturally, has to hedge against a rising China. And as ASEAN looks around the neighborhood and tries to find countries it can work more closely with, the most obvious partner is India. And the important thing to emphasize is that there's a 2,000-year history of relations within India and Southeast Asia. And out of the 10 ASEAN states, 9 of them have an Indianized cultural base, and only 1, Vietnam, has a Sinicized cultural base. So clearly, the potential is there. If you look back at the past 2,000 years of history, if you allow the natural reconnections to surface, you should be seeing a far stronger relationship between India and ASEAN in the years to come. And I hope that Prime Minister Modi will also take advantage of that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adib and Kishore, for very good presentation and a good comment. Time for questions. That's 3 good questions. NK Singh. Yes. And one more. NK, we could use the microphone here and you.
My question, for good reasons, is best to Kishore. And the question is this, Kishore. In your last book, The Asian Hemisphere, printed on the 23rd of January, 2008, you came to certain conclusions in regard to the rise of Asia and the reasons which you have explained in the first part of your comments today. Now that book was published 6 years ago. The rise of the Modi phenomenon was nowhere in sight, not nowhere. So if I were to ask you that if you were to rewrite the second version of the book, and you were to factor the rise of the Modi phenomenon, what are the assumptions which you believe would like to revisit to come either the same or what varied conclusions?
Thank you, NK. You first and then.
My name is Vijay. This is a question that arose out of Professor Kishore's comments on the lack of faith in multilateral organizations. Would you say that the formation of the BRICS Bank is a step in that direction, and have we reached the point of no return on that?
Sorry to interrupt you. He did not express skepticism about multilateral institution, but he just said the UN Security Council, in its present structure, is out of date, and unless it's reformed, he will lose his credibility.
But it's something which follows, because the BRICS Bank arises out of lack of faith in World Bank and IMF.
Okay. All right, Kishore. Not too many questions for Kishore. Can we have some questions for Adib? Yes?
Direct question, Mr. Adib. China has shown exceptionally high level of enthusiasm now in this juncture towards developing stronger ties with India. Now I wish to know how sincere are the Chinese this time around in wanting to forge stronger ties with India, especially in the midst of their crisis with Japan and some ASEAN neighbors.
Thank you.
And one more thing, President Xi Jinping has invited Mr. Modi for the APEC summit in November. Now, does this imply that India is going to join as an APEC member, or what's the motive behind? Thank you.
I'm sorry, President Xi Jinping has invited Prime Minister Modi to the APEC summit, and I don't think he can do that because... East Asia Summit, no, not the APEC Summit, East Asia Summit. Just on China, may I just make 2 points on China, which are facts that may not be well known. Number one, the new Chinese Premier Li Keqiang chose India the first country to visit. And I thought that was an important signal from Beijing that it attaches the highest importance to China's relations with India. It is also significant that soon after Prime Minister Modi's inauguration, the Chinese President Xi Jinping sent his Foreign Minister Wang Yi and his special envoys to call on Prime Minister Modi and to invite Prime Minister Modi to visit China. And when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, some of you may not know, he visited China 4 times. So he has developed a knowledge of China. And I'm told, and somebody can check this, that 90% of China's total FDI in India is in Gujarat. So, Adi, do you want to reply on China?
You know, several of the sub-questions which are contained in that statement all emanate from an overall anxiety about how to deal with the rise of China. Therefore, a question on whether the Chinese are sincere in their new initiatives or overtures vis-a-vis India. Well, I could be mechanical and say that's a question you should address to the Chinese, but in the profession to which I have devoted most of my life, I would say we welcome those initiatives, and we propose to react positively to those initiatives. China, by any yardstick, is a very important country. It has the world's second largest economy, about $7.5–8 trillion, as against the United States, which has a $14–15 trillion economy. It has a much larger population base, with per capita incomes rising. It's only a matter of time when in overall GDP terms, the Chinese will be the world's largest economy. But more important than the size of the economy and its GDP is the phenomena of what the rise of China implies, not only for the countries in its immediate neighborhood, but also for the rest of the world. When I was ambassador to Brazil, the Brazilians had a slightly different attitude towards the rise of China, because they saw in the economic growth that China was registering a great opportunity for its agricultural exports and its commodities to be exported. Some of us who have had outstanding border, and there are not too many countries, I'm afraid we are one of the few which has an outstanding border issue to be resolved. There are different kinds of factors which we have to play. Mr. Modi, as Chief Minister of Gujarat, looked at the potential for economic cooperation with China. And you're absolutely right, Ambassador. The Chinese are building one of the world's largest mega cities in Gujarat, along with ILFS, if I remember correctly. And there is tremendous opportunity. The previous Prime Minister used to say that we look at, Dr. Singh, that we look at the prospects and potential for economic cooperation with China in very positive terms, because we believe there is enough room out there for both of us. I remember a discussion many years ago at the beginning of the UPA's term, when the Prime Minister of India, in an interaction with the Chinese Prime Minister, his counterpart, mention a figure in terms of where bilateral trade with China and India could go. And the Chinese counterpart responded by saying, why are we being so modest? Let's look at 100 billion. And now we probably are looking at 100 billion, except that the figure is heavily weighted in favor of the other. Now, countries in Southeast Asia, countries in South Asia have to come to terms with the rise of China. And I believe you have to come to terms with the rise of China, not through choices which you have to exercise. And I like the Singaporean approach. From my point of view, I look at enhanced relations with the United States as being important not only for their own sake, but I find that whenever we've had a strong relationship with the United States, it also gives us extra leverage and space in dealing with the Chinese. Equally, I always respond very positively to suggestions of the kind that Ambassador Kishore made today, that when countries in the ASEAN region look at, he used the word insurance, I thought somebody else did, I look at it slightly differently. You know, you cannot but try to work out the terms of engagement with an economy which has $8 trillion of GDP and which is now looking at becoming the world's largest economy. Yes, you may need to have your own bilateral arrangements. There was a question on, the BRICS, lack of faith in multilateralism. If you permit, Ambassador Ko, I would like to walk into that. The BRICS is a plurilateral, it's not a multilateral grouping. I think none of us can afford to lose faith in the multilateral institution. Even at the same time, try and work the plurilateral. I mean, the Multilateral Trade Organization is the World Trade Organization. But when there was an impasse in the multilateral trading system, that's when people started looking at free trade agreements and other agreements. So one reinforces the other. I personally do not believe that the BRICS Bank, important as it is intended either to replace or even become an alternative. It's a very small beginning, but it's something which shows that developing countries can get together and look at issues relating to development finance and come to them. And this is a new complex world which is arising. And I think the invitation that the Indian newly elected Prime Minister was given to attend a particular summit meeting is a small step in that direction. What it will lead to is early days. In my presentation, I very carefully avoided any comment on, because I'm more cautious by nature. I don't know where things are going to play out, but I think we have a major challenge on our hands in that the new government will have to calibrate its foreign and economic policy very carefully in charting a heavy minefield when it comes to our traditional alliances, our distinct, and how, in what terms and conditions we work out with the Chinese. Because that arrangement at the end of the day has to be anchored not only in economic cooperation, but we have security concerns as well. Thank you.
Sure, okay, question. Well, number one, thank you, NK, for your question. I like it when people ask me questions about my books, and I hope you all buy the books as a result. What would I do differently if I wrote the book today? You know, actually, I've been writing about the rise or return of Asia for about 20 to 25 years. And the good news for me is that every year I keep talking about the rise of Asia, Asia keeps rising. So it helps me a lot. All my predictions are coming true. But what's remarkable is that I'm surprised that so few people have noticed that just as I mentioned that India is entering a geopolitical sweet spot, Asia as a whole is going to enter a sweet spot of economic growth. And you know why? By a remarkable coincidence. This is an accident of history. The three most populous countries in Asia, China, India, and Indonesia, are simultaneously going to have strong, reform-minded dynamic leaders. Xi Jinping can easily go down in history as the third most powerful leader that China has had since its creation, since 1949. After Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, Xi will be regarded the third most powerful leader of China. I only met him once, only spent 2 hours with him. But it's amazing how much power he has accumulated in less than 2 years. And he's going to use that power to drive through some painful reforms that China needs. And if he succeeds in these painful reforms, China will take off again. And Prime Minister Modi, I don't have to say very much, the first session we got lots of insights into him. I'm actually convinced that Prime Minister Modi also has the opportunity to emerge as the third most powerful leader in India since independence. After Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime Minister Modi will be recognized as the third most powerful leader. And amazingly enough, even in Indonesia, where clearly the two most powerful leaders that Indonesia has had has been number one Sukarno, number two Suharto. I think Jokowi has the opportunity to emerge as the third most powerful leaders. I will spend 7 hours with Jokowi on December 18th, driving around Jakarta with him in a car, having long conversations with him, trying to understand what his goals and intentions are. And I'm convinced, like Xi Jinping, like Prime Minister Modi, he'll bring radical reforms to Indonesia. So this means if the 3 most populous countries in Asia begin to simultaneously reform and move up, this is going to create, last night we talked to Goh Chok Tong about 2 jet engines, China and India. Now we're going to have 3 jet engines in lifting us up. So the opportunities for Asia are going to become even brighter than what I wrote 6 years ago, and that's how I would land the book. But I mean, fortunately the book has been translated in 15 languages, so it's doing very well. Now the BRICS question, Vijay, actually I agree with you that the fundamental problem that the West has with the Security Council is the same problem it has with other multilateral institutions, and certainly the IMF. And here the tragedy is that even though at the G20 meeting they agreed on a formula for reallocating the votes in the IMF so that China today, which has less votes than the Benelux countries, less than Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg combined, is supposed to get more, but is being blocked by the United States Congress. And if I may say something slightly provocative here, the United States Congress has got its head firmly dug into the sand, doesn't understand there's a new world that is emerging, and that the United States has got to change and adapt to. Now, if the powers of persuasion will not work, then frankly, what will work is the creation of alternative institutions. So if BRICS gains momentum, if the Asian Infrastructure Bank gains momentum, if the Chinese investment vehicle that they set up gains momentum, then this will progressively make the IMF and the World Bank irrelevant. So that's the choice that the West is going to have. The same problem that he has in the UN Security Council. Either you change the composition or you lose your credibility. In the same way with the IMF and the World Bank, if they don't reallocate the votes, they'll become irrelevant. So I actually think that things like the BRICS institution are ways and means of putting pressure on the West to wake up and realize that the world has changed and you've got to change too.
Thank you, Kishore. Thank you. I have to bring this to a close so we can go on to the last session. I just want to make one observation that culturally, there seems to be a fundamental difference between Indian diplomats who are cautious and prudent and some Singapore diplomats who are provocative and outspoken. But could I just sum up this session could I just sum up this session with a few points? Point number one, I think Prime Minister Modi is aware that India's voice in the world must be undergirded by strong economic performance at home. Point number one. Point number two, I think we in Singapore were very impressed that he has taken the initiative to try to improve India's relations with its immediate neighbors. His invitation to the sub-leaders to attend his inauguration, the fact that the first two countries he visited were Bhutan and Nepal, all this reinforce what Hardeep said, that one pillar of his foreign policy is to have good relations with your neighbor, to create a neighborhood of peace and prosperity. Third, I would say that there is an opportunity in the coming years for a significant change in Sino-India relations. I'm not sure whether it will play out, but I see early signs of a possible paradigm shift in Sino-Indian relations. And I think former Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong said something last night which is very important, which is that there will be no peace in Asia unless there is peace between India and China. And so we in Singapore want to see peace, friendship and cooperation between India and China. And my final point is that India's relationship with Southeast Asia and with ASEAN is a win-win relationship. Because of history and culture, there's a deep pool of goodwill in Southeast Asia for India. India should tap into this pool of goodwill and significantly upgrade your relationship with ASEAN, not just economically, but in all the other spheres. So with those few remarks, I'd like to, Jamshid, with your permission, bring this to a conclusion and ask you to join us in thanking Hardeep and Kishore.